What would you do if you followed a road no one else remembered and found a whole village still waiting at the end of it? In the autumn of 1867, 19-year-old Claire Hayes walked past the last hedgerow of her parish for the price of an afternoon's curiosity and stumbled on a woodland settlement that had been sealed behind bramble and silence for 60 years. What she found there, what the coach had carried, what the parish had buried, and why no living tongue would name the place, is a story the county has never fully told. Stay close, settle in. Let us know where you are listening from tonight, because the lane she took begins right here in the soft gray light of a Wednesday after rain. Claire came down the Briar Hollow Road with her bonnet strings loose and her boots wet through at the seam. She had walked the 6 miles from her aunt's house since breakfast, and she carried in her apron pocket a folded letter that had ended at last the small hope she had allowed herself since spring. The place at the parsonage would not be hers. Another girl, from a family with a name, had been chosen. The vicar had written kindly. Kindness, Claire had learned, did not put bread on a table or a roof above a head. Her mother had been 6 months in the churchyard. Her father had gone before that, to the fever of 2 winters past. There were no brothers. There was an aunt with a narrow parlor and a narrower patience, and there was the long gray country between hedgerows that Claire had walked since she was a child. She walked it now because she could not bear the parlor, and because walking was the only labor left to her that no one could refuse. The lane she took beyond the last farm was not one she had chosen on any other day. It ran east of the meadow gate, past a broken stile, and into a stretch of oak wood that the older men at market called simply the Shut Road. She had heard the phrase all her life without asking what it meant. Today, with the letter folded small and heavy against her hip, she asked nothing of anyone and turned her boots into it. The hedgerow closed over her within 100 paces. Hawthorn had grown across the track in a low green vault, and the ruts beneath her feet were soft with 60 autumns of leaves. She could hear no cart, no plow, no dog. Only her own breath, and somewhere beyond the branches, water moving in a ditch. She thought, without meaning to, of the mail coach. She had heard the story 100 times from old Mrs. Ainsley by the fire, how in the year the old queen was still a child, a coach bound for a woodland village had left the turnpike at dusk and never arrived. No wheel rut, no lantern, no horse recovered. The village itself, Mrs. Ainsley would say, had gone quiet not long after, and the road to it had been let go. When Claire had asked which village, the old woman had only pressed her lips together and said, "We do not name it now." Claire had thought it a fireside tale. She thought so still as she pushed through a curtain of ivy and came, without warning, to a gate. The gate was iron, and the iron was red with rust, and behind it the lane opened into a clearing where cottages stood in a crooked row. Slate roofs sagged, chimneys leaned. Every window she could see had been shuttered from the inside and nailed. A well stood in the middle of the green with its rope rotted to threads. There was no smoke. There was no sound. There was, at the far end of the row, the whitewashed front of a small inn, and above its door a signboard so weathered she could not read the name. Claire stood with her hand on the cold iron and did not move for a long minute. The wood breathed around her. A single crow lifted from a gable and went without calling. She had come, without asking, upon the shut village itself. The gate was chained, but the chain had rusted through at one link, and the link parted when she touched it, as though it had been waiting only for a hand. Claire stepped inside. Her boots made no sound on the moss that had covered the packed earth of the lane. She walked past the first cottage, and the second, and stopped before the third, because a wooden pail still stood by its doorstep, filled to the brim with rainwater, as though set there that morning. She looked at the pail for a long while. Then she looked at the door and saw that it, like every other door in the row, had been nailed shut from the outside with fresh-cut planks now gray with age. Someone had sealed these houses. Someone had gone from door to door with a hammer and a purpose, and had left the village standing exactly as it was on the last day anyone had lived in it. At the inn yard, at the end of the green, the great double gates to the stable court hung crooked on their hinges. Claire pushed one, and it moved. Inside the yard, under a slate roof half fallen, stood the mail coach. Its lamps were tarnished black. Its wheels were sunk to the hubs in leaf mold. The mailbox on its side was still padlocked, and the padlock was still whole. She would not have believed it if the pail of rainwater had not already asked her to believe. She stood in the yard with the wet gray light on her face and the folded letter in her apron pocket, and she understood in a slow and cold way that she had walked out of one life and into another. Would you have turned back at the gate? Would you have opened the mailbox? What do you think a village is willing to bury to keep a road shut for 60 years? If a quiet story told slowly is the kind you love, leave a word below and stay with us, because what Claire did next, in the yard of that sealed inn, is where the real telling begins. By the time Claire reached her aunt's cottage that evening, the wet had gone through her stockings and her hair hung dark under the loosened bonnet. She said nothing of the shut road. She hung her cloak by the range, unlaced her boots at the step, and set them where the leather might dry without cracking. Her aunt, Mrs. Betsy Harrow, watched her over the rim of a teacup and said only that supper was cold, and had been cold this hour past. Claire ate the bread and the boiled onion without lifting her eyes. In her apron pocket, folded small, the vicar's letter had gone soft at the creases. She could feel it against her hip like a second, colder pulse. Word travels quickly in a market parish. By the next morning, the news that the parsonage place had gone to the miller girl was already at the pump, already at the smithy, already at the door of the wool merchant. Claire went out at 8 for a half-pound of salt and heard her own name spoken twice before she reached the shop counter. A woman she did not know clicked her tongue as she passed. Another said, loud enough to be meant for her, that some girls thought too well of themselves and were surprised when the world thought otherwise. At the corner of the market square stood Mr. Roderick Pell, who kept the largest farm on the north side and had been a churchwarden 12 years. He was a wide man in a good coat, and he had a voice built for open fields. He saw Claire and lifted his stick in a mockery of greeting. "The Hayes girl," he said, to no one and to everyone. "Turned down at the parsonage, I hear." Claire did not stop. "A pity," he went on, louder, "though I did tell the vicar. A girl with no people is a girl with no character. It stands to reason." Someone laughed. Claire kept walking. Her face did not change. She had learned, in the 2 winters since her father, that a silent mouth cost less than a bitter one. At the shop, the salt was weighed out in brown paper. The shopkeeper's wife met her eyes only once, and gently, and looked away. Claire paid her coin and turned for the door. An old woman was sitting on the bench by the shop window, wrapped in a black shawl, her hands folded on the head of a blackthorn stick. Mrs. Ainsley. The same Mrs. Ainsley who, years before, had told the story of the coach that never arrived and would not name the village. She was older now than seemed reasonable. Her eyes were pale and clean as rinsed glass. Claire made to pass her with a small bow of the head. Mrs. Ainsley lifted the stick a bare inch, enough to stop her. "Girl," the old woman said. Her voice was thin and dry, but it carried. "What is buried keeps. What is sealed keeps too. But what is sealed with a living hand does not sleep the way the dead sleep." Claire stood very still. The salt was heavy in her hand. "Ma'am," she murmured. Mrs. Ainsley only looked at her, a long look, as though measuring the depth of a well. Then she set the stick down again and turned her face to the square and did not speak further. Claire walked home with the words folded inside her, unopened, next to the vicar's letter. She did not understand them. She knew only that they had been meant for her, and that they had been meant for the shut road, and that Mrs. Ainsley had known, without being told, where her feet had been the day before. That night, in the narrow bed under the eaves, Claire lay with her eyes on the low beam above her, and listened to her aunt banking the fire below. She thought of the pail of rainwater. She thought of the padlock still whole on the mailbox. She thought of a hammer going from door to door. At first light, she took her mother's old oilskin from the hook, wrapped a heel of bread and a wedge of cheese in a linen cloth, and left a note on the deal table, saying she had gone to look for windfall apples in the far lane. Her aunt would not question the lie. Windfalls were currency in a lean autumn. The morning was colder than the last. A fine white mist lay in the low fields, and the hedgerows dripped without wind. Claire walked steadily. The 6 miles had become familiar in the way any hard road becomes familiar when it is walked twice. Past the last farm, past the meadow gate, past the broken stile, into the oak wood. The hawthorn vault closed over her again. The ruts were softer today, blackened by the night's rain. She reached the rusted gate before the sun had cleared the tops of the trees. The parted link she had touched the day before hung loose where she had left it. Claire slipped through and stood a moment in the crooked green and made herself look at the village without flinching. By daylight it was worse and better both. Worse because the ceiling of it was clearer now. She could see, on every cottage, the same pattern of 5 nailed planks across the door, driven in a careful cross-hatched way that spoke of a single hand or a single trade. Better because the place had not the malice she had feared in the night. It only stood. It stood the way a room stands with its lamp put out. She went to the inn first. The great double gates of the stable court she pushed wider than yesterday, and the hinge cried once, and then was quiet. The mail coach was where she had left it, the leaf mold heaped to its hubs, the lamps blind. She circled it slowly. The panels were dark green under the dust, and along the door, in gold letters half-eaten by weather, she could still make out the words Royal Mail, and below them the number of the run. On the roof rail, the guard's iron horn lay lashed with rotted cord, exactly where a guard would have hung it upon arrival. Upon arrival. That was the small wrong thing. A coach that had never reached the village would not have its horn stowed. A coach whose guard had climbed down at journey's end would. Claire noted it. She did not act on it. She had promised herself, walking, that she would look before she touched and listen before she looked. She left the mail coach where it stood and went into the inn's kitchen door, which was not nailed. It opened at a push. Inside, the flags were dry. A long table ran the length of the room with 3 benches drawn neatly to it, as though the last diners had risen only a moment ago. A tin kettle sat on the cold range. On the mantel, a candle stub had been snuffed with wet fingers. The black wick was still bent. Claire spread the oilskin on the flags near the hearth. She ate a little of the bread. She sat with her back against the warm-colored wood of the settle, though there was no warmth in it, and she listened. The village made small sounds. A rafter ticked. Water ran somewhere under stone. A crow called once, far off, and was answered by nothing. She stayed until the light in the kitchen window went from gray to blue to the first honey of late afternoon, and then she lay down on the oilskin with her cloak drawn over her, and she slept an hour in the shut inn while the shut village listened back. She woke to a sound that did not belong. It was a small sound, and it came from above her, in the beams. A tap, and then a pause, and then a tap again. Claire lay still under her cloak and counted the pauses. They were not the pauses of dripping water, which fall in a rhythm of their own. They were more careful than that, as though something with intention had touched wood, thought a moment, and touched it again. She sat up. The kitchen was blue with the last of the afternoon. She did not move for a long minute, and the tapping went on, and then stopped, and then did not begin again. Claire rose. She folded the oilskin, tucked the linen cloth back into her pocket, and looked up into the beams. The kitchen was a low room, and the joists ran across it black with the smoke of 40 winters. Nothing stirred there. She held her breath and looked at each beam in turn until she saw, at the far end of the room over the settle, that one of the joists did not run true. The others crossed the room in a straight line, notched neatly into the wall plate. This one had been let in a hand's breadth lower and a hand's breadth farther from its fellows, as though it had been shifted in a hurry and never put right. It was the sort of thing a carpenter would notice, and no one else. Claire's father had been a carpenter before the fever. She fetched the bench and stood on it. The misplaced beam was not misplaced at all. It had been cut through in 2 places and joined back together with iron braces let flush into the wood and painted black. Above the braces, in the small space between beam and ceiling, someone had scratched a mark. It was not a carpenter's tally. It was a letter, a single letter B, cut carefully into the timber with the point of a knife, and below it, smaller, a date. 1807. Claire stared at the numbers until the light in the window failed further and she could no longer make them out. She climbed down from the bench. She did not touch the beam. She put the bench back where she had found it. 60 years, she thought, and a letter that was not her own initial and not the initial of anyone she knew, and 1807 was a year older than her aunt. She walked once around the kitchen with her hand trailing along the whitewash and stopped at the doorway to the tap room. The tap room door was closed. She did not open it. She had told herself she would look before she acted, and she had looked enough for one day. She banked the ashes in the cold range from habit, though there had been no fire, and she went out through the kitchen door into the yard. The mail coach stood as she had left it. She walked past it without looking at the lashed horn and pulled the stable court gate half shut behind her. In the crooked green, the cottages watched with their nailed eyes. Claire crossed to the well and looked down. Far below, a coin of gray sky floated on black water. She dropped a small stone. The sound came back late and clean. The well was deep, and the water was still there. She left through the rusted gate. Walking home under the hawthorn vault in the failing light, she felt the letter B and the year 1807 in her chest, the way a splinter sits under the skin before the finger finds it. She came again the next day, and the day after that, and the day after that. On the fourth morning, she brought her father's tool roll from the bottom of her trunk. It had lain there wrapped in oiled linen since the winter he died, and she had never opened it. She opened it now on the deal table before her aunt was awake. Inside were a claw hammer, a small pry bar, 3 chisels of graduated width, a folding rule marked in inches and feet, and a short handsaw with the teeth still bright. The handles were smooth dark where his palm had held them. Claire ran her thumb along the hammer's grip. She wrapped the tools again and put them in a satchel with her bread and cheese and the oilskin, and she walked the 6 miles. She began with the inn. She did not touch the misplaced beam. She began with what could be cleaned without decision. She swept the flagstones. She scoured the long table with sand and cold water from a pitcher she filled at the well. She washed the tin kettle and set it on the range, though there was no coal to burn. She took down the shutters from the kitchen window one by one and set them in the yard, and light came into the room such as had not lived there since the coach came. Where the shutter joints had been driven with the same 5-nailed crosshatch as the doors, she drew the nails carefully with the claw of her father's hammer and dropped them into a tin. The nails were hand-forged and square-headed. They were older than the wire nails the village blacksmith sold now. Claire noted this and did not act on it. By the 3rd day of labor, a cat had appeared. She was a lean gray thing with a torn ear and eyes the color of cold tea, and she came out from under the settle on Claire's second morning and sat watching. Claire had brought a scrap of cheese that day for herself and gave half to the cat, who took it without hurry and stayed. After that, the cat was there each morning when Claire arrived, sitting on the doorstep of the inn kitchen as though she had waited the night. Claire named her nothing. The cat needed no name. She walked at Claire's heel from room to room and settled where Claire settled, and when Claire stopped to think, the cat pressed once against her knee, warm through the wool. On the 5th day, Claire drew the nails from the taproom door and pushed it open. The taproom smelled of cold ash and old beer barrels. Behind the counter, on a slate meant for tallies, someone had written a list of names in chalk gone chalky soft with damp. She counted 22 names. Beside each was a small mark, a cross, or a circle, or a dash. The list was headed, in a careful clerk's hand, "Present." Claire copied the names into the back of her folding rule with a stub of pencil from the tool roll. She did not know yet why she copied them. Her hands were doing what her mind had not yet caught up to. That afternoon, in the small parlor behind the taproom, she found a bootjack by the hearth, with a boot still in it, as though a man had stepped out of it and never returned. On the mantel stood a pipe in a rack, the bowl half full of tobacco gone to gray dust. In a drawer of a small oak desk, she found a bundle of undelivered letters tied with red tape, addressed in a dozen different hands, all directed to households in Briar Hollow Parish. None had been opened. She set the bundle back in the drawer. She closed it. The cat, on the hearthstone, opened one eye and closed it again, and Claire understood then that whatever had happened here, The mail had come as far as this room and stopped. On the 6th day, Claire came earlier than she had come before. Mist lay in the meadow like poured milk, and the hawthorn dripped onto her shoulders as she passed under it. The cat was on the doorstep. Claire set down her satchel, took up the tool roll, and went straight to the small parlor behind the tap room. She stood in the doorway a long moment. The boot jack still held its boot. The pipe still held its dust. The desk stood square against the inner wall, and the inner wall she saw now in the flat morning light was not the same wall as the tap room's. It stood forward by the width of a hand. She had not noticed this before because the wainscot ran continuous, painted the same tired green, but the skirting on the parlor side was newer wood, and the nails in it were wire nails, and wire nails were a thing of the last 20 years, not the last 60. Claire moved the desk. She moved it slowly, walking it corner by corner across the boards so that its feet would not gouge. Behind it, she found what she had begun to expect. A panel of plaster stretched between two studs, whitewashed, and stitched to the wainscot with the same wire nails. She sat down on the hearth flags and looked at the panel for a full minute. The cat came and sat beside her. She fetched the chisel and the small pry bar. She did not swing the hammer. She worked the chisel behind the wainscot at a nail, eased the nail out, set it in the tin with the others. She did this 11 times before the panel came free in her hands. She laid it down flat on the floor and looked into the space it had covered. The space was a chamber no larger than a pantry, unlit, with a low door set into its far side. Claire took a candle stub from her satchel, struck a match on the hearth, and held the flame up. The light showed her, in fragments, what the chamber held. A stack of oilcloth-wrapped bundles, roped and sealed. A small iron strongbox on a plank shelf. A ledger bound in green leather, laid flat. And at the back, propped against the wall, 3 canvas mail sacks with the crown stamp on their flaps and the seals unbroken. Claire set the candle on the shelf beside the strongbox. She reached first for the ledger, because a ledger she understood. She lifted it and carried it out into the parlor where the light was better and laid it open on the desk. The first page bore, in the same careful clerk's hand as the taproom slate, the words, Briar Hollow Smallpox, 1807. Below that, a list of dates, and below the dates, the 22 names she had already copied into the back of her folding rule. Beside each name, in the ledger, was written a fuller mark. Cross for died, circle for recovered and departed, dash for detained in place. Claire counted. 15 crosses, 4 circles, 3 dashes. She turned the page. In the same hand, by order of the parish and the county, this village is closed at both roads until the sickness has spent itself. Mail into or out of the village to be held at the inn, no traveler to be permitted to leave. God have mercy on those within. Claire sat down on the parlor chair. She read the page twice. Then she read the pages that followed, slowly, in the small, even hand of a man she thought must have been the innkeeper. The coach had come in from the turnpike on an evening in the 4th week of the sickness, unaware, its guard and driver already ill by the time they reached the yard. The innkeeper had taken them in. He had unhitched the horses. He had lashed the guard's iron horn to the roof rail with his own hands. He had written to the postmaster at the turnpike station by a boy who was told not to enter the village, but to leave the letter at a stone at the parting of the ways. The letter had asked that the road be closed at that stone, and that the closing be silent, so that no help would be attempted and no infection carried out. The postmaster had done as he was asked. The parish beyond had, in time, done more. Sealed the cottage doors from the outside, once those inside were past the door themselves, so that whatever the sickness had touched should stay touched. Claire closed the ledger. She rested her hand on it. In the chamber behind her, the mail sacks stood in their 60-year quiet, and the strongbox held, she now understood, what the innkeeper had gathered from the pockets of the 15 crosses to be sent back to their people when the sickness had spent itself. It had spent itself and taken him with it. There had been no one left to send. The cat came in from the tap room and jumped onto the desk and lay down on the closed ledger. And Claire, who had not wept for her mother in the church, or her father in the barn, or the vicar's letter on the road, wept then, quietly, with one hand on the cat's warm back and the other flat on the green leather. She was still there when the light in the parlor window began to change, and the wind rose in the wood outside. The wind came up out of the west before Claire had wrapped the ledger to carry. It hit the inn signboard first. She heard it creak against its iron, and then bang, once, hard. She stood, put the candle out with her fingers, and went to the kitchen door. The mist was gone. The sky beyond the stable court had gone the color of a bruise. Rain began before she had reached the yard, cold rain slanting. Claire had 6 miles to walk. She would not make 3 of them before dark. She would not make one before the road was mud to the ankle. She stood in the kitchen doorway with the cat winding at her boots and the wet coming in, and made her count. Her aunt would sit up an hour past dark, no more, and then would bank the fire and go to bed with the door on the latch. There would be scolding in the morning, and there would be tongues in the market by noon, and if any tongue named the shut road would not be hers alone by evening. She thought of the ledger. She thought of the sealed mail sacks with the crown on them. She thought of the strong box and the 15 crosses and the small, even hand that had written "God have mercy." She thought of Mrs. Ainsley on the bench, saying what is sealed with a living hand does not sleep the way the dead sleep. She understood the sentence now. A man had sealed this place with his living hand, and it had not slept. It had waited. Claire closed the kitchen door against the rain and slid the bar across. She was staying. She lit the candle stub again, went to the tap room, found a lamp on a shelf with a half-inch of oil still in its well, and lit that too. She fetched the oilskin, folded it into a pallet by the settle, and laid her cloak on top. She broke the bread she had brought and set half aside for morning. The cat ate a corner of cheese and washed her face. The rain came harder. It found the slate roof over the stable court and ran off in sheets. Under it, the mail coach stood as it had stood for 60 autumns, patient. Claire went out once, in the worst of it, wrapped in the oilskin, to check that the great gates were latched and that the horn on the roof rail was still lashed as she had left it. Because these things had become, in her mind, hers to keep. The wind pushed her hair flat to her scalp. She latched the gates. She came back in. She was banking a fire she had built with dry kindling from a basket by the range when she heard the knock. It was not a knock at the shut door of a cottage. It was a knock at the kitchen door of the inn where she stood. 3 raps, then a 4th, weaker. Claire took the lamp and opened the door with the bar still in her other hand. A man stood in the yard, streaming wet, with a woman leaning on him and a child bundled inside his coat. He said, "Please." His face was gray. The woman's eyes were closed. The child was very small and did not move. Claire said, "Come in." She said it without thinking. She stepped back and held the door wide, and they came in and dripped onto the flagstones she had scoured, and she barred the door behind them. They had been on the turnpike, he said, in the carrier's cart, when the horse had gone lame at the parting of the ways. They had seen a light through the trees. They had walked toward it. The woman was his wife. The child was their daughter, 2 years old, feverish since morning. Claire looked at the child in the lamplight. She thought of 1807 and 15 crosses. She thought of what the parish had done then and what a girl with no people could do now. She put her hand to the child's forehead. Hot, but not burning. She unbuttoned the man's coat, took the child, and laid her on the oilskin by the fire. "Dry clothes," Claire said. "Off, both of you." She turned her back and knelt by the child and worked at the wet wrappings with hands her father had taught to be careful. The cat came and lay against the child's feet. Claire pulled a blanket from the settle and covered them. She did not think, that night, of the ledger or the sacks or the strong-box. She thought of keeping a fire and keeping a kettle hot and keeping a strange child breathing until morning. When the man asked, near dawn, what this place was, Claire said only, "An inn that has been shut a long time." He did not ask again. His wife slept. His daughter's fever broke an hour before the rain stopped, and she opened her eyes and looked at the cat and made a small sound that was almost a laugh, And Claire, at the range with the kettle in her hand, understood without saying it that she had already decided what she would do with what she had found. By mid-morning, the rain had thinned to a gray drift, and the man was well enough to help Claire draw water at the well. The woman sat by the fire, with the child on her lap. The child ate a corner of bread soaked in warm water and would not let go of the cat's gray back. The man asked Claire her name, and Claire told him. He gave his own, and it was a plain name from a village Claire did not know. He said his wife's brother kept a smithy at the turnpike stop, and that if Claire would allow it, he would walk that way when the road firmed and send word to her people that she was safe. Claire thought a moment. Then she said, "Send word to the vicar at Briar Hollow, and to Mrs. Ainsley at the shop bench. Tell them both to come." The man looked at her and did not ask why. He set out at noon. By dusk of that day, the vicar had come the 6 miles in a covered gig with a lantern lit against the mist, and Mrs. Ainsley had come with him wrapped in her black shawl, her blackthorn stick across her knees. Mr. Roderick Pell had come too, uninvited, on his own horse, because a churchwarden who hears the vicar is called does not stay at home. The rusted gate stood open to them. Claire met them in the crooked green in her mother's oilskin with the cat at her heel. She said only, "There is a ledger you must read." In the small parlor, with the lamp lit and the panel set aside, the vicar read the green leather book from first page to last without speaking. Mrs. Ainsley did not read. She sat in the parlor chair with her hands folded on her stick and her eyes on the plaster wall as though she had known these pages before they were written. Mr. Pell stood in the doorway with his hat in his hand. When the vicar closed the ledger, he set his palm flat upon it a long moment, and then he lifted his palm and said quietly, "It is all here. The parish register has a gap for the year they could not fill. This is the gap." Mr. Pell cleared his throat. He did not look at Claire directly. He said, "The Hayes girl found it." His voice had none of the market square in it. He said it again, to himself, as a man tries a sentence for its weight. Then he said to Claire, "There will be work. I can send men with a cart." Claire said, "Not yet. The sacks must go to the postmaster with seals still on. The strongbox must go to the vicar. The names on the slate must be read out in church." The vicar bowed his head. Mrs. Ainsley lifted her stick a bare inch as she had at the shop and set it down again, and she said, "The living hand rests now." Word spread through the parish in 3 days. A clerk came from the county post, a young man with careful spectacles, and he opened the sacks in the vicar's parlor with 2 witnesses and a written record. He counted letters undelivered for 60 autumns and read the addresses aloud, and the vicar wrote each one into a book. Some of the names had no one left in the parish to receive them, some had grandchildren. The clerk said to Claire, without flourish, "You have done what the office could not. You have brought the mail home." The strongbox held rings, a watch, a silver locket, a bundle of pressed flowers tied with hair, coins wrapped in named papers, and a child's wooden horse. The vicar restored each to its family, where a family remained. Where none remained, he laid the token in the churchyard with the name spoken over it. 15 crosses were carved into a new stone at the parish's cost, and the 22 names were read out at the Sunday service, and no one in the pews spoke while the reading lasted. Mr. Pell came to Claire's aunt's cottage on the 4th evening. He stood on the step with his hat in his hand. He said, "I spoke ill of you in the square. I was wrong." He did not offer more, and Claire did not ask more. She said, "Thank you, sir," and closed the door gently. Her aunt, who had heard from the parlor, did not speak of it, but that night she set out a second candle at the table without being asked. Outsiders came in the following weeks. A gentleman from the County Antiquarian Society walked the shut road with the vicar and made drawings. A woman from a town Claire had never heard of came in a black bonnet and stood a long time at the new stone, and then she took Claire's hand in both of hers, without words, and pressed something small and warm into it, a folded page in a hand 60 years dead, addressed to a mother the woman had never met. The vicar's letter about the parsonage place was never spoken of by anyone again. The Miller girl kept it, and no one in Briar Hollow thought less of Claire for that. The market square, when Claire crossed it now, went quiet in a different way. Hats were touched, and older women nodded, and the shopkeeper's wife weighed the salt with a hand that no longer needed to be gentle to make its meaning. Claire went back to the shut village through the winter. She unshuttered the cottages one by one, drew the nails from the doors, aired the rooms, and let the light in. She did not live there, and she did not intend to. The village was not hers to inhabit. But she kept the inn kitchen swept, and the fire laid, and the lamp trimmed, so that any traveler lost on the turnpike who saw a light through the trees would find a barred door that would open, and a settle, and a kettle that could be made hot. By the following autumn, on a still evening of low gold light, Claire walked the 6 miles once more. The hawthorn vault had been cut back to a proper lane. The rusted gate had been replaced with a wooden one, painted plain. The well had a new rope. Above the inn door hung the old signboard, cleaned and legible again, with a small carved line beneath the name that read, in the vicar's hand copied into paint, "Kept, 1867. The cat, grayer at the muzzle now, sat on the doorstep as though she had never sat anywhere else. Claire stood in the green, with her hands loose at her sides, and looked at the row of unshuttered cottages. Mrs. Ainsley had died in the spring, in her own bed, with her stick against the wall. The vicar had said her name at service. Claire had wept for her, and in weeping for her had wept at last for her father in the barn and her mother in the church, and had come out of that weeping quieter and lighter and no longer a girl with no people. The man from the storm night had come back once in the summer with his wife and his daughter, and the daughter, 3 years old now and unafraid, had run to the cat and buried her face in the cat's fur and said a word that was not quite a word. The woman had held Claire a long time without speaking. The man had said, plainly, "You kept her breathing." Claire had said, "The fire kept her breathing. I only kept the fire." Now, alone in the golden light of the crooked green, with the cat at her ankle and the inn signboard steady on its iron above the door, Claire spoke aloud, once, softly, to no one but herself and the place. "I did not inherit a house," she said. "I inherited a keeping." She stood a moment longer while the light thickened over the slate roofs and the wood beyond. Then she went inside and lit the lamp and set the kettle on the range and left the kitchen door on the latch. Thank you for staying with Claire the whole 6 miles and the 60 years, for sitting through the quiet, and for trusting that what the world seals sometimes waits for a patient hand. If this story kept a fire in you tonight, leave a kind word below, tap the like, and follow along. Another lantern is already lit down the next lane, and we will walk to it together.